I ended up writing a client a check for $200,000 because I made a pretty big mistake. I call my lawyer. I'm like, hey, what did we miss? And he goes through our contract and he goes, you need to have an exhibit in your contract that states the billable rate.
Welcome back to the Modern Craftsman podcast. Today, we are going to dive into two things. One, a recap of our most recent Contractors Coalition Summit. And two, more exciting, labor burden. What is labor burden? It is the total cost a business incurs to employ a worker beyond their direct hourly wage or salary. It includes all additional expenses associated with that employee, such as payroll taxes, insurance benefits, and other indirect costs. So many of us are not accounting appropriately for labor burden. So Nick and I are going to dig into mistakes that we've made, what it's cost us from a financial perspective, and how we account for the labor burden associated with employees, both as per Nick's business and my business, because they are a little bit different. And then we are going to give you the offer of a free labor burden calculator if you're signed up for the newsletter. So definitely hang around, talk a little bit about CCS, how much fun it was, what you missed out on, and why you should sign up for Chicago. And then also diving into labor burden and how, if you are not accounting for that, you are leaving a ton of money on the table and most likely putting work in place that is not profitable.
With that being said, this podcast is brought to you by Andersen Windows. If you're building with vinyl windows, there's a better option that could actually help you save time and costs over the long run. Andersen 100 series products are available at a comparable price to vinyl, but they're also made with a material that's designed to be better in extreme temperatures. One way they're able to do this is by using their innovative Fibrex composite material instead of vinyl, which is twice as strong and has the ability to hold up to high heat, even in dark colors. And unlike some of the vinyl alternatives, Fibrex composite material has a smooth, consistent finish that looks great in a variety of homes. This is why Andersen 100 series products are known as the smart alternative to vinyl. For more information, head over to andersenwindows.com/modern craftsman.
This podcast is brought to you by Buildertrend. Here's a real talk moment. Growth is great until your systems cannot keep up. If you're juggling projects with spreadsheets, group texts, and whiteboards, it's only a matter of time before something slips. Buildertrend's construction software brings all of it together: your budgets, your schedules, your team, and your clients all in one spot. It's like finally getting your business together without the duct tape. Schedule a demo at buildertrend.com/mcdemo and see how the pros scale without the chaos. Trust me, your future self will thank you.
This podcast is also brought to you by Velux. Velux's cut, place, and seal installation makes adding skylights to your build easier than ever. Experience worry-free installation with 3 layers of leak protection, solar panels, and built-in rain sensors, and leave your clients speechless. Include skylights in your next project and visit veluxusa.com/remodeler to learn more about their industry-leading warranty.
This podcast is brought to you by Harnish. Maintaining a professional appearance and consistent branding on a job site can increase your effectiveness by 23%. Harnish Workwear understands the importance of branded apparel. Their H-Label program offers elevated, customizable work uniforms. Whether it's through embroidery, print, or custom patch applications, they'll collaborate closely with you to ensure your team exudes a cohesive and polished appearance. Their team of skilled in-house printers and designers deliver customized gear fully prepared for use. Head over to harnishworkwear.com to elevate your brand.
Before we get into it, one last thing. Contractors Coalition Summit.com for the event we're hosting November 7th through the 10th in Chicago. Go check it out. The San Francisco of the Midwest.
I don't think people from Omaha were that fond of me. If you weren't there, you don't understand what Nick's saying. But I had some fun.
I don't think the people that were there understood what you were saying.
No, I think maybe it was just me and about 3 or 4 people. But I was comparing Omaha to a lot of different places and basically saying that they were similar to Omaha. But Nick and I and Morgan and Brad and Mark and Doug and a bunch of other team members were just in Omaha, Nebraska
Mm-hmm.
for the 7th CCS event, I
Yeah.
believe. 7th or 8th, they said.
Yeah.
Which was fun. Different than other events. I think maybe we'll just take a few minutes to recap your perspective of the event, how it went, and then just like some of the takeaways. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I recognize with this event, I guess being more comfortable, being more engaged, talking to everyone who was there, sponsors, attendees, partners, everything else. This was the most fun I had at any event, and I was looking back on it, and I was like, we pretty much we worked, we did a fair amount of educational training sessions, but like I feel like we were all laughing the entire time with
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think, we ran, the structure was a little different this time, but we still managed to get through everything that we wanted to. But yeah, I think, I mean, it's funny what happens when there's not ideal situations. And in this particular scenario, it was 105 degrees with 40-mile-an-hour winds
And humidity.
and humidity. And it literally, so you're outside, it literally feels like you're standing in front of a hairdryer. It was insane. And at one point, it was just hot. We were done with education for the day. We were going to go do this event. And then we were like, you know what? We sent out an email, everyone back to the pool, tabs open, come eat dinner and enjoy. And I had no plan on, I mean, I brought a swimsuit, so I guess I did plan on going in the pool, but I didn't really think I'd spend much time in the pool, if at all. And what we end up spending until like 10 o'clock that night. And it was,
Yeah.
it was cool because it was this, the education sessions are super intense because there's a ton of information. Everyone is like, feverishly, taking notes and trying to ask the right questions at the right time. And, a situation, where it's after dinner and everyone's hanging out and chilling. There's so many good conversations where it's, we just get to know each other at a deeper level. And you think over 200 people now have attended CCS, which is insane to me. I told Mark, I was like, I really thought we were going to do Nashville and that was it.
Yeah.
And, now 200 people have shown up, just attendees, never mind the countless vendors and plus ones and everything else. Like that's a lot of people. And to be able to have one-on-one conversations and just kind of, build a strong community. And that's really what it's about.
Yeah, I think for this one, it just seemed as though all of the guests there, with everything that was going on, with whether it was, just audibling and heading down to the pool and hanging out, that everyone let their hair down. And right, like a lot of times it's a short amount of time. You're probably not going to be as vulnerable as you should be to maximize the return on the investment, to open up the window to your business, to your personal life, to who you are. Right, you're going to show up and you're going to have a straight face and you're going to act professional and ask the right questions and say the right things. And it wound up being with like the weather, having to change some plans and somewhat flying by the seat of our pants when things didn't go in as anticipated, that everyone was like, oh yeah, like everyone, nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You can see into what's going on. You can see into how we're trying to make this as great as possible. And I think that everyone just kind of let their guard down a bit and connected on a more personal level. And yeah, there was professional connection as well. But I think that it just made for, I don't know, a bunch of banter, like inside jokes, camaraderie between everyone. And it got me thinking that for future events, like to me, this seemed like a social event, a mini vacation, and also the educational aspect of it. And I'm like, that's the ticket. Like it's the perfect blend of all three, right? We could create an event where everyone's coming and it's just business, no talking, no phones, 10 hours a day where we're just grinding it out. Or we can create a mini vacation where there's really great social aspects of it, having some fun, staying loose, laughing.
Hmm.
And again, I look back at this and I'm like, I don't think, not at work aside, like I don't think I've laughed that much in a while. Like I'm still kind of smiling thinking about it. It was just, it was really enjoyable.
Yeah.
Don't know if I need to go back to Omaha. Might be set there. Um, but it was fun. It was one
We
of the
love
most,
you, Omaha.
yeah, I had a lot of
Sure.
fun.
Yeah. No, I'm excited. I think you hit it. We were there, and it was exactly as you said. It was like a social event, and being able to hang by the pool and just chat. That was super cool.
Because I
And
think what happens is, right, you're charging money for this event and you're trying to deliver and quantify like how much value's there
yeah,
from like a deliverable standpoint. When you like this was social proof to me that there's more than just like the tangible quantifiable deliverables, and there's a lot to be said for letting your guard down and developing actual relationships.
you're spot on because we've done it well. Not we've always had the social aspect of it, but there's definitely been past events where it was more structured, and I didn't build those relationships, and we just didn't keep in touch after.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's I have a list of people that were I keep in touch with now, and I plan to follow up with because I want to either we there's kind of mutual help. It's like, hey, they're working on something, I want to continue to be a resource. I was talking to someone, I was like, my biggest thing with this is I want to make sure that when you leave here you can implement it.
Yeah.
What are going to be the missing pieces that are preventing you from actually implementing this stuff in the business. So, well, with that being said, we're heading to Chicago November 7th through the 10th. And I mean, if you want to come, I would urge you to book your ticket. I know we threw a banger of a discount, a couple weeks ago when we were in Omaha. Unfortunately, that discount has expired. But if you want a Modern Craftsman discount, you can shoot us a DM and we can get you a discount code to sign up. But we'd love to see you in Chicago. We're excited to. Yeah, I actually have not been to Chicago.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm excited to be there.
I've been maybe twice. It was a while ago. I really enjoyed it. It's a nice city. Pretty clean city.
Oh,
So I had
good,
fun. I'm
good
looking
to know.
forward to it. Yeah.
Well, so I want to get into something because I told a story when we were in Omaha that I think had a lot of people a little bit surprised, just based on the nature of it. So just to cut to the chase, I ended up writing a client a check for $200,000 because I made a pretty big mistake, and that mistake was, we were well. I want to preface this the right way. We were doing this project. It was a big renovation project, and it was essentially this evolving scope. By the time we finished the project, the project grew by 4 times the original contract value, and there was heightened frustrations because, frankly, we weren't even the only contractor on the job site. This was a job that we kind of took mainly because of the time in our career that we needed a project and some unforeseen circumstances in the market that prevented us from continuing some other projects, whatever, blah, blah, blah. All that to be said is we were getting towards the end, and the client started getting very upset that the project wasn't done, but it was this evolving project, and actually threatened one of my guys and said that he was going to put us out of business. And, obviously my guy calls me and says, "Hey, this is what's going on." I'm like, what in the world are we talking about? We're there every day. Like, this place looks amazing. What is going on? And he essentially said that our contract stated one thing and we were doing another. Again, not really sure what we're talking about. I give him a call, and come to find out, we had been billing our billable rates for all of the labor on the job site, and in our contract it didn't say anything about billable rates. So what that means is I was billing out someone, say, $75 an hour, which would be anywhere from 75 to 100 is a market rate for a good carpenter in Boston. So we're billing our carpenters out at $75 to $100. But we didn't have that labor rate defined in our contract. So our contract is cost plus, means we can only bill the actual cost. So we got audited on this project, and they went through all of our financial records, which I just gave up. I was like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm full transparent. I
I'm
would
not
like,
doing anything wrong.
yeah, like here you go. Here's all the receipts, and they came back and they said that you've overcharged us $200,000, and we expect you to pay that back, or we will come after you. And I literally wrote them a check for 200 grand and sent it back to the client, and moved on.
So the problem, the discrepancy, between what you were charging, they were saying that $75 an hour isn't the cost of your employee. Like you were
Yeah,
paying them less than that.
exactly. So they were like, your charge, like you pay them, say it's $35 an hour, right? W-2. So then I went through and it was like, yeah, but here's the actual burdened rate. So we'll get to that in a second, but we were making a profit on the labor, as we should be. So of course I call my lawyer. I'm like, hey, what did we miss? And he goes through our contract and he goes, you need to have an exhibit in your contract that states the billable rate. And because since you're, especially being that you're cost plus, so cost plus means you're charging the cost plus a predetermined percentage fee or predetermined fee, whether that's a dollar amount or fee. I mean, a percentage. But if you're going to charge a rate for something, you can charge a rate, but that needs to be defined in the contract
Specifically or explicitly.
Yeah. So, whether that's labor or say you're charging an insurance fee, you can set a 2% insurance fee, but it needs to be defined in the contract and agreed upon. So we, from that point, we spent a couple $1,000s with our lawyer, rebuilt our contract, and now, we have exhibit in our contract that states every rate. It also states when those rates can change for fluctuation. So you have a multi-year job, like the rates can go up, et cetera, et cetera. But in this exercise, I realized, I wonder if I'm actually accurate in terms of what this employee costs.
So before we get to that, Can we take a step back? How could we have avoided this? There's the exhibit, right, where you have a billable rate or a market rate, or not a market, but like a billable rate. Or I guess you could have had your cost plus, but then you would have had to had within your contract or within your invoicing cost for all of the cost associated with that employee, right? So like you would have had to have either a percentage or an hourly cost for payroll, taxes, workers' comp, general liability, all that stuff. So that's the other way that you could have avoided this. You didn't have either. You were charging a billable or a market rate, and they were basically saying, well, this isn't the actual cost because you didn't spell out that there were costs above and beyond just what what you're paying them.
Yeah. Right. So, that project goes, we learn from it, and we dig in real hard on, all right, what's the true cost of this labor? And I want to say something, like high level. If you're self-performing labor, you should be making a profit on that. And I'll give you an example before we dig into like the specifics of burden. But I had a client after that client, a couple of years later, say, hey, are you charging me a labor rate that includes profit for your labor, and then you're getting your cost plus on top of that? And I said, I am. And the client said, that's double dipping. I said, well, I don't really love that term, but I guess if you want to look at it that way. And she said, well, I don't want to pay a markup on a markup. I said, no problem. I said, what we can do is, and rather than use our in-house labor, I'll sub everything out. And she said, well, what do you mean? I'm like, I'll just sub it all out. The market rate for a carpenter is $75. So I'll just sub it out. That way, when I transfer it over to you, you're paying the exact same price, but at least I'm not making additional profit. And she smirked and she said, well, that doesn't change anything. I said, right. I said, the additional profit.
And that's because when a subcontractor gives you a number that you are paying them, they have profit in it for themselves.
Right.
And then you're having your company profit on top of that.
Right. And
so that's like what essentially you're doing. Even with in-house labor, you still are accounting for your profit, but then you have your plus on top of that.
Right. And as you should, because if you have in-house labor, there's costs that go into keeping those guys in-house. It's everything that goes above and beyond, training them, the culture, the work parties, the work events, the bonuses. There's, and just then, that's the overhead associated with it that doesn't necessarily always get captured in the rate, but then the profit. You're taking the risk of having employees. You're like, that is a risk that you're incurring, so you should be profiting for that. And so the client ultimately was like, well, that doesn't make sense. I'd rather work with your guys. I said, the price is the same either way.
Yeah.
You're going to get, you know what you're going to get with my guys. We're a company, with the company culture. And she was like, okay, understood. That makes sense to me. And it never had an issue beyond that. But we went into this kind of, we literally printed out a year's worth of transactions, thousands of line items, and just went through and basically said, is this associated with, we did 2 exercises. This is when we really started digging into the cost of running a job versus running the business, and basically like said, if we had no projects going on, would we have this cost? And if the answer was no, then it was a job cost and we made sure we were billing for it. But we did the same thing for labor. And we just kept going through line by line and highlighting things that were associated directly with an employee. So, obviously payroll tax, 401k contribution, health insurance, dental, vision, all of that stuff is kind of pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But then it was the vehicle. And so then we built out this spreadsheet that, okay, well, how much is the vehicle? What's the monthly payment on that vehicle? What's the insurance rate for that vehicle? How much are you spending in fuel per month? And we basically built all this stuff out on a monthly cost. And that way we'd have a monthly cost, and then we could divide it down to week, day, and per hour. But as we continue to do it, and we look at this thing every 6 months. As we continue to do it, we kept finding things. So I'm going to pull it up because I just want to make sure I don't miss it.
Do you have different burden rates for different types of employees, or are you averaging that for all employees?
Different rates. Different rates for
different roles. Yeah.
And I'm going to explain, and there can be a swing in what our markup is. I'll get to that. But so just going down the list, we have cell phone. Like, are we paying for their cell phone? Their vehicle, are we giving them an allowance, or do they get a company vehicle? How does that break down? Software. So we found that about $1 per hour is what it costs us for the software stack that each of these employees have. And that's, their project management platform license, Adobe license, Bluebeam license, the $8 a month I pay for their custom email, an amortized cost for their laptop, iPad, so on and so forth. Workers' comp, based on what their role is, their workers' comp is different. A super versus a carpenter versus, office, their workers' comp rate changes.
Yeah. And
same thing with general liability. Their general liability changes based on that role. So then we have this direct cost, which, we understand, this employee, just for example, like, hey, this guy makes, we pay him $24 an hour. All right, that actually costs the company so far $30 an hour. And then we factor things in like, how many company holidays are they? How much PTO do they get per year? And then we make sure that we understand the PTO cost. So that $30 just turned into $35. And then we look at, okay, now what's the market rate for that particular role? So market rate for that role would be anywhere from like $50 to $65 an hour. So we'll just call it 65. You're making $30 an hour on this role. As they say they start making $26, $28, $30, say the role that they fill ranges from 25 to 30, our billable rate doesn't change.
Yeah.
And the reason we felt comfortable with that is essentially if you're on the low end of that rate of that role, you're going to make more mistakes and the company's going to be paying for more, basically paying more to fix things or paying for your inefficiencies. You get paid more based on less mistakes, higher efficiency. So, we're not necessarily tracking the inefficiencies, but in theory, the person that's making on the low range is going to make more mistakes, so that margin is larger. So we're capturing those inefficiencies in that larger margin. And as you get to the top end of that rate, that margin is smaller, but you're essentially dipping into it less for mistakes.
I mean, you also, from a job perspective, don't know who's going to be on what job for how long, even if you're bidding work that's 6 months out, if that employee is going to be with you. So you have to understand when you're looking to replace those people, if they leave, or if you lose them, or for whatever reason, that you replace with somebody who fits within that range, and it avoids having to actually have like an exact dollar number for that employee and then saying, it's this much for this employee, this much for that employee. You're covering a range within that the cost of that employee. I think that's something that I realize, even with your labor burden, that you should be accounting for is like downtime and inefficiencies. We don't work in a perfect environment, in a perfect world, and to bid something, to price something, to have labor rates that are based on 100% efficiency. Like, you might have a job, and if it rains that day, you're going to have less productivity than if it didn't. So you should be somehow accounting for that within your labor burden. If you think that you're going to get 100% efficiency for 40 hours a week, you're foolish, and you're going to be losing money. And that's something that I did for a long time. Even as the owner of the business, if I want to be able to have 40 hours a week on the books that I can charge my clients, I probably have to work 50 hours a week. So can I capture those additional 10 hours? There's a lot of downtime associated with the work that I can't necessarily bill them for those 10 hours. So how am I building that into my rate to ensure I'm getting paid for those hours, and I don't actually have to work 50 hours in order to just invoice for 40?
Well, so we have a line item on there called break even hours. So essentially, based on that margin, assuming that they are operating efficiently, that particular role that I was just giving as an example, they need to work 21 hours a week to be billable. If they work less than that, that means we're losing money on that employee.
Yeah.
If they're any hour that they work above and beyond that is additional profit. So if you think, 21 hours, that's half the week. Once they hit half the week, it's great. Now you're in the profit. You're profiting. But what that does is it helps capture the downtime, the inefficiencies, the in-between work, the company events, the meetings that they're attending as a company, what we call general time. And we take this information, we basically run a report every week and look at every employee, how many hours they worked, and then what profit we're making on those hours. So that way we can see if we're dipping into general time, what's going on? Why are we spending so much time on general? And it might be because that particular employee is working on something that is for the business or higher level, or they're in between jobs. But at least we're looking at it and understanding it on a regular basis.
I looked up the definition of labor burden, and like in layman's terms, it's the real cost to your business. For every hour an employee is on the clock, not just what you pay them, right? So you have to understand that. Another mistake that I made forever, right, where it's like, people tell you, mark them up 15% and then mark that up 15% for your profit. To me, it doesn't work that way. You should be accounting for all of the costs associated with them, and then your profit. And if you're cost plus like Nick, at that point you need to have your plus above the line on top of that cost as well. Some typical labor burden components, Nick mentioned a bunch of these, but payroll taxes, workers' compensation insurance, general liability, health insurance premiums if you're paying them, retirement contributions if you're paying them, PTO, vacation, holidays, sick days, training, onboarding, downtime, work vehicle costs, maintenance, insurance, fuel, phone, tablet, software, tools, safety gear, and uniforms. So those are a lot of costs that go into the price of having an employee, that if you are not capturing them, you're going to be losing a lot of money fairly quickly.
Yeah, and it's, a couple things on that. One of them, going back to PTO for a minute, you also have to consider, okay, well, I'm just using that as an example, but PTO, we get, this is factoring in like 2 weeks. So 2 weeks of PTO equals about $2.40 an hour. That's direct cost, meaning that that's what it costs to send that person on PTO for 2 weeks. But something to consider is if that person needs to be replaced while that other person is out, or someone has to take the role of that person, you should be accounting for that as well.
Yep.
And again, to simplify this, like if you're listening to this when you're driving or working, we actually have a downloadable. You can have this Excel. It's completely free. It's on our website. We'll put a link below. But the simple way to summarize this is, if the only reason you're spending that money is because of that employee, that's part of the cost.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, that person goes away, that cost in theory should go away. Maybe it's harder to get rid of a truck because it's, you can't just return it to the dealership and say, I'm done with it. But, in theory, that person goes away, the cost goes away. That person is there, you incur that cost.
I mean, it comes down to being like a direct cost, right? If you're cost plus and you have your direct costs, and that's what you're putting your builder percentage plus on, like, that's a direct cost associated with that job. If that employee is not driving to that job to work, he does not, or she does not need that truck. Right. They don't need the uniform. They don't need the cell phone. They don't need the software. So that cost is directly tied to the execution of that project and the production of that project. So understanding all of those costs that go into your direct costs to make sure that you're accounting for that needs to be accounted for. And, you're a smaller company. Maybe your employees don't have all of these, right. They don't have a truck. Maybe they don't have contribution into retirement. Maybe they don't have health insurance. Like, you have to understand what's going into the cost of these employees. There's still costs associated with them, even if it's just inefficiencies that you need to account for to make sure that you are not bearing the costs of those employees and your the jobs that you're doing and your clients that you're working for are.
One of the questions that comes up is, do we use a flat percentage, to mark all of our labor up? And the answer is no. And the way we do it is we look at, again, market rate. And follow-up question is, well, how do you know what market rate is? Okay, that's a good question. If you were to hire a 1099 carpenter, what are they going to charge you? Oh, it depends. Well, what's it depend on? Well, it depends on who I talk to. It's like, okay, but that is probably related to their skill level. Sure, you probably have some guys out there that are charging an arm and a leg because they just want to charge more money, and they're maybe they think they're more valuable. And you probably have the opposite of where guys are not charging enough for their time. But what is the market rate if you were to go hire a carpenter on 1099? And it, for us, 75 to 100, sometimes $120, depending on the carpenter. Okay, well, then you should be accounting for that. And at the minimum, just hit market rate. If you feel as though your guys are better or you can sell the premium, sell the premium. But if, and what that does is, number one, it keeps things consistent. But number two, if, say, your employee does take PTO, or has to go, gets hurt or quits, whatever the case is, and you're moving in the job and you have to replace him, and maybe you can't make a hire, but you can get a 1099 guy in place. Now everything stays the same. That they come in, hey, I'm $75 an hour. Great. I was billing my guy out $75 an hour. So it's the same. It's the same thing. Now you're just not necessarily profiting on that person, but ultimately you're because they're a subcontractor and you're subbing it out.
But this is why, like, so many times people want to just say, well, what are you charging for your employees? What do you charge for yourself? And it's completely irrelevant, right? Yeah. Like, even if, simplest terms, you're doing market rate, like, your market's different than my market. What you can charge for your market rate's different than mine. But then if you're looking at it from this, like, fully burdened rate, your burden rate's going to be different than my burden rate. One, because the employee might cost a different amount. But then two, your business is structured with different percentages and different costs that you're putting on top to get that burden rate. So you have to understand what works for you, and what Nick charges, what I charge, two completely different things. So asking, what's your builder's fee percentage for a cost plus builder, or what are you charging as a T&M contractor? Like, it's completely irrelevant. The question would be, like, how are you coming up with that rate? because if you understand how you're coming up with that rate, if you use this labor burden calculator, then you can plug your own numbers into it and you have a basis. Like for me, being T&M, it's closer to like the market rate type of perspective, but I need to have what's called a loaded labor rate. So my loaded labor rate that I'm presenting to the client contractually covers all of the burden plus the overhead and profit. So like I'm not putting that plus 10, 15, 20% on top of that labor rate. So I need to make sure that my loaded labor rate accounts for the fully burdened rate plus my overhead and profit. So my number that you see as far as a labor rate in my contract would more than likely be higher than Nick's, because Nick's labor rate within his contract then gets an additional builder's fee put on top of it. So you have to make sure contractually you understand how you operate as a contractor, how you're charging, and contractually, legally, how those numbers are supposed to be communicated and written within your contract. But I know mine is different. It's a loaded labor rate, and there's no percentage being applied on top of that. So I have to explicitly state what my loaded labor rate is for what roles, what employees, to ensure that I protect myself on the back end and I can actually charge for that. As far as like this burden rate and starting to determine that, I know that you had this one job where it was an issue, but you already started understanding like what your burden rate was and what you needed to profit. But like, how did you start figuring that out? How did you understand what to put on as far as profit goes? Like, what was the discovery process like for you?
Honestly, I think we just knew that. I mean, early it was nothing. It was simple. It was just, we're going to bill a rate, and we didn't know. We just were billing a higher rate because we knew that labor wasn't just labor. And I think on one hand, I was lucky in the sense that I just went right to market rate. But truthfully, we had some employees that we were billing out at market rate, but when we went back and fully burdened them and understood what their costs were, we were losing money.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of them, like one of them, I remember it was literally $2 an hour. So basically the company was paying $2 an hour for that employee. So we said, all right, well, that employee either needs to become more efficient or we need to up their rate. And we ultimately leaned on finding more efficiency to make sure that we were basically capturing that employee's cost against multiple jobs rather than just one.
Yeah.
But, I think early on we were just, we weren't considering it as a profit. We were just considering it as this is a labor rate and it's covering the cost of of all the direct costs related to that.
Yeah.
But to your point, it's just like running the business, until you really understand what it costs you to do something, you're just flying by the seat of your pants.
Yeah.
And, one of the examples we brought up in Omaha was, I had a couple of years ago where every job was super profitable. So when you look at individually, man, we're killing it. We're making great profit. But then you bring all that profit down, and then you run your expenses against it. We were spending more on more overhead than we were collecting in cash. So individually, projects can look really profitable, but when you bring it all the way down to the bottom, if you're spending more than than you are bringing in for profit, it's gone.
So let's unpack how that happened for you.
Yeah.
And potentially how that may happen. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one way that could happen is when you are determining your costs, whether it's your burden or it's your builder's fee and your percentage, it's based on the overall volume of work or your revenue that you're generating in a certain year, right? So you're saying we're doing X amount of $1 million or whatever that revenue is, and then you're trying to allocate a percentage per hour per unit cost of that job that you're applying to those projects based on a proposed amount of work that you're putting in place. So if you end up with a lighter year, say you sold $10 million the year before, you've now redefined all of your numbers based on your projections of $10 million or more for the next year. Maybe you project that you're going to sell $12 million, and you only sell 7 or 8, now the amount of work that you're putting in place, that percentage markup actually needs to be higher because you have less jobs, less unit costs, less direct costs that you can apply that markup to. So yeah, it all looks profitable, but you actually are not generating enough direct costs for your business to apply that markup to cover your overhead. So at the end of the year, you didn't have enough work to cover your overheads. Your jobs were profitable. The numbers worked out. You managed them correctly, but you didn't bring in enough direct cost or sell enough work or generate enough revenue to actually cover your overhead. So your business didn't make money.
Yeah, I mean, we can bring this back to labor. So that's why we have the break even number, where every hour, if you're, let's say we're billing this guy out $65 an hour and he costs the company 35. We're making $30 per hour. That sounds like a lot of profit. But say he only works 21 hours a week. Or I'm sorry, let's say he works 40 hours a week, but only 21 of them are billable to a job. Well, now that $30 an hour I was making now goes to paying the other 19 hours.
Yeah.
So at the end of the week, zero profit. And that's what happens on the bigger scale of overall revenue, where it's, you're just simply not working, you're not doing enough billable work. So all of your profits are eaten up by the general tasks, the non-work.
Yeah.
And for me, it wasn't that I wasn't aware of that at the time. I was just heavily investing into marketing and basically operating at a $10 million a year company versus, what I was producing was closer to 7.
Yeah, so it's all of those costs that aren't directly tied to the job, like your direct costs and what would be like, quote, above the line was all making sense. Your numbers worked out. It was everything that was below the line, like the overhead of your business that is not directly tied to job costs, that was too high based on the amount of work that you were putting in place, right? So if your overhead is $1 million for that year based on a $12 million revenue projection, you have to make sure that as you go each quarter and as you're lining up these jobs, that you are understanding, hey, we need to sell and generate $3 million worth of revenue each quarter. If we're under that, our percentages that we're charging for our markup, like what would be your actual plus fee, that needs to go up. Or else you're never going to cover your overhead because you're just not putting enough work in place.
Right.
So that's as clearly as I can put it, where it's like you have to understand what your projections are for the year, and you have to make sure that you're maintaining that, or if you're not, that you're adjusting your pricing or finding efficiencies if you've already contracted that work, or finding a way to put that work in place that doesn't cost you as much money because you've built an overhead based on a $12 million projection and you're only putting $8 million of work in place. You will never cover the overhead of that business.
Right. And, this goes back to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. That's a big reason why. I mean, forever, I just worked. Didn't look at what our projections were. I shared an email last week about, the fact that we lost $2 million off our revenue projections, and how that I would have freaked out before. But now I look at our revenue projections and our cash flow forecast and understand, okay, well, all right, we're going to have a couple tight months, but end of year, we'll be good.
Yeah.
And without knowing that, I mean, for me, I'm an anxious person. I have if I don't think about what's happened to me. I don't slip into depression, but I'm constantly slipping in and out of anxiety. And it's self-inflicted often. And for me, I think I can't remember if I shared this on the podcast, but recently I was feeling wildly overwhelmed with stuff on the personal side, and I felt like I was falling behind, and I had this mountain of mail sitting on my desk, and I was just like, I know I need to go through that, and I need to go through it and like make sure I don't have any past due bills. And literally that day I walked out to my truck being booted because I had unpaid parking tickets. And that was, it was so stupid. Like a friend of mine texted me, they sent me a picture of my truck. He goes, "Is that yours?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "You're an idiot." I'm like, "Yeah, 100%." And I go get my truck back, come back. I'm like, I'm sitting here and I'm going to go through all the mail. And and it was, I remember every envelope I opened, I was like freaking out. I'm like, this is just going to be, I'm going to write down a number that I don't know how I'm going to pay. This is going to be so frustrating. And I do go through all the mail. Oh, that's it. And in my mind, I made this like mountain out of nothing when, the reality of it was, it was primarily the parking tickets I didn't pay because I'm an idiot. And then a handful of other things that were fine. And it's the same thing with business. It's, you go through, anxiously, like hoping that you're just going to continue to work, bring in money. But, for me, 5 years ago, that's all I did. And then I'd overwhelm my team and say, hey, I need you to go here. I need you to go there. And we got to get this job done. And hey, before you finish that one, go to this job. And it was a nightmare. There was no organization. And sure, like our revenue numbers were up, but did they need to be?
Yeah.
I didn't know because I wasn't I didn't know what we were spending on overhead. Now, I know what we spend on overhead. So I know based on the overhead that we're spending, we need to do X amount of dollars per year. And that number is plastered on the wall. And it's, we meet every week and say, all right, it's June. We're halfway through. Are we halfway to our revenue goals? I had this conversation with someone at Contractor Coalition Summit, and they were saying, what their goal is for the year. And I was like, well, what have you done to date? And I think it was like a quarter of the target. I said, you're halfway through the year. Are you going to do 75% of your work the last 6 months of your year?
Yeah.
Well, probably not. I'm like, right. So right now is the good time to adjust that projection. Because if you're going to go the rest of the year thinking you're going to do, $5 million when you've only done maybe $1 million so far, you're going to be pretty short, and you're spending money, you're spending overhead like you're going to make $5 million.
So I'm looking at, I'm typing some questions and like some prompts right here. So this is why it's so important. You hear everyone say to know your numbers, and that's not just, hey, I figured out my numbers for last year, I can walk away from that, we're good to go. Mm-hmm. You have to constantly be monitoring this. And like, I guess it can become fairly convoluted, and it can become fairly complicated and overwhelming, but it's not necessarily like you have to know your numbers with regard to what's being, the type of work that's put in place, how much, what it costs you, what you should be marking up, what your overhead is. But just if you look at bigger picture, like, understanding how you're tracking as far as revenue, because everything is based on that. Your overhead's based on that. Your profitability is based on that. How much work you should be putting in place, what you're selling at the end of the year. And the fear is that you're putting less work in place, right? So you're not covering your overhead, so you're less profitable. But there's also risk in doing way more work that you anticipated. You're bringing in money, right? If you sell $2.5 million work this year and everything was based on $1.5 million of projections, like, you're going to make more money, but what you have to be careful of is your overhead will probably go up, because in order to put more work in place, it's going to require more input, more resources. So your overhead will go up. One of the dangers there are tax projections, right? Where it's like, you don't realize you made $1 million more this year, and you didn't monitor that to, like, your overhead probably went up from a numbers perspective, so the percentage dropped. Mm-hmm. But like, what about all of that additional profit that you didn't account for, that you didn't put money aside for to pay your taxes at the end of the year, when you made $1 million more, or you had $1 million more in revenue? Your profit was definitely not $1 million more. But if typically in years past you've paid $20,000 a quarter, you probably should have been putting more money in. So if you're not accounting for that, like, the dangers aren't just coming in on the low side of revenue, but also if you're going way over, understanding how you should be adjusting and paying your tax liability quarterly, so that the end of the year doesn't come and you're like, oh my God, I owe way more in taxes than I thought. And I thought we had money in the bank, and we were spending money probably more frivolously than we should have from a business perspective. So there's dangers on both ends of the spectrum that you should be aware of. How are we? What's the best way for us to get people the labor burden calculator?
We'll put it. I mean, if you go to moderncraftsman.co, up on top of the
There should be a drop down.
yeah, it's so I'm just gonna pull up the website to make sure I'm saying it correctly. But yeah, if you go to moderncraftsman.co shop extras, you can get that. You can click right on that labor burden calculator, and you just name an email, and we'll send it to you. And it's an Excel file, so you can open it up, and everything is self-explanatory. It's right in there, and it walks you through calculating that labor burden. I think you go through that exercise. If you have questions, obviously email us, hello@moderncraftsman.co. I'm typically monitoring that. Well, I am monitoring that email. But why don't we'll also attach it if you're not part of our newsletter. You should be, and you should head over to the website and sign up for the newsletter. But every week we send out the show notes, and we'll include the attachment in that email.
Are we? Should we do that, or should we make them sign up for the newsletter?
Well, if there's that's what I'm saying. If they sign up for the newsletter, they'll get it.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying like we'll attach the link to sign up for the newsletter and you can get it, but we're not just giving them the document, right? Should we?
No. The show notes are only for people that are on the newsletter.
All right, perfect.
Yeah,
right,
so we'll put a link below the show. I'm sorry, the show notes on the podcast streaming platform of your choice will have a link to sign up for the newsletter. Yes. No freebies. You got to
you got to at least get on the newsletter. So what we should also do, Nick, is we should have one of our workshops where we allocate to explaining how to use that labor burden calculator. So that if you download that and you want to know how to use it, we set an hour aside at some point to hop on and have like a real life walkthrough of what that is. So all great information. Something that I kind of, if you are not accounting for labor burden and you don't know what you should charge, you don't know your numbers right now, but you want to get something in place and start heading in the right direction, I would recommend whatever you are paying an employee to 2x that, and then whatever you want for profit on top, right? So if you are paying an employee $20 an hour, 2x that, they're going to cost you 40, right? So you're going to break even at charging your clients or billing your clients at $40 an hour. So then put whatever you want as far as profit and overhead on top of that. But like if you want to get started and right now you don't understand all your numbers to even get into this labor burden calculator, that's a great way to at least get started and make sure that you're somewhere in the ballpark of charging. Like, what do I charge for an employee? 2x their number and put your overhead and profit on top of that. That's going to be my little bit of a tidbit for you to at least get you in the ballpark of the right direction. And the one last thing I want to talk about with regard to this, Nick, you may have something else, but I believe we were in at IBS maybe 2 years ago, and it was an older gentleman. He was retired at this point. His company did bathrooms, like small bathrooms, $20,000, $30,000, like not huge jobs. And their specialty was just turning these projects over really quickly. Bathrooms are difficult to turn over quickly. So he created this like business niche for himself by doing this. And he mentioned with regard to labor burden that he realized early on that he made more money when his guys and girls worked overtime. And I was like, how does that work, right? You're paying whether it's time and a half or double time for them to work overtime. And what it came down to was that much of his labor burden would not be 2x'd when he paid them to work overtime, meaning you don't need another truck, right? If you have an employee and he already has a truck and you're paying him for overtime at 2x, you don't need to bring another employee on to put in another truck, right? So he could pay his smaller amount of employees an overtime rate, but his overhead of his business to put that work in place didn't necessarily double. He didn't need to pay 2x their insurance. He didn't need to buy 2 trucks for that person. He didn't need to have 2 cell phones. So like a lot of the numbers that were associated with that labor burden don't double when you're paying somebody overtime. And I was like, I thought that everyone tried to avoid paying overtime because it made them less money, or they couldn't capture that cost with regard to what it costs them to put somebody on a job, when in actuality, there were a lot of items that would be applied as an overhead to this labor that he doesn't actually 2x, even though he's paying the rate for them is more, right? So if you have 2 employees and your billable rate for them is $35 an hour, whatever it is, it's $70 an hour. Now, if you have 1 employee that's paying overtime, what you're paying them per hour may go up, but the labor burden associated with that probably doesn't go up. So when you look at the overall hours going in, it's actually costing him less money to put work in place by paying employees overtime, which he wouldn't have known if he didn't understand the labor burden. And I thought that was just like a really neat perspective that was like, holy crap, I never thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar perspective around 410s. When guys switch to 5/8 versus 410s, and the argument is you've lost, you basically reduced the mobilization demobilization by 2.
Yeah.
So now you're working, you're working the same amount of hours, but not setting up, cleaning up two times.
Correct.
And guys, the only way to know this is to actually measure it and track it. And you'll hear us talk about that a lot. If you joined us in Omaha, you heard us kind of beat that into the education, and that's what it comes down to. Is we've, as you heard in the beginning, I've made some big mistakes and expensive mistakes, and I want to continue to share a lot of that here and through our newsletter. I'm a little bit more open and candid in the newsletter because you guys just read it. But the whole point is to share, what mistakes we made and how we learned from them and how you can avoid them. So if you want to be a more profitable business, take it from us. These are the little things that can make really big impacts.
Yeah.
Well, guys, appreciate you listening. If you have not signed up for the newsletter, please do so, moderncraftsman.co. And if you want to join us in Chicago, you got to get on that newsletter because we have discount codes in that newsletter for you to sign up. Otherwise, you're not getting one. And maybe you'll join us by just happenstance and paying full price. But if you want to be part of the Modern Craftsman community and ultimately the Contractor Coalition community, sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch with what we got going on. And as always, thanks to our sponsors.
Trust my mama, you're no match for my bad karma.